Our first speaker is Lara Brown. Lara is the outgoing president of the Cambridge Union. In her spare time, she's also a third-year English literature student at Downing College. She's looking forward to retirement and spending some time with the much-neglected romantic poets of her dissertation. Lara, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Chris. I'm looking forward to watching your debates from afar. I'm not sure how familiar you all are with the slightly antiquated traditions of this society, but for those not aware, the presidential debate motion is set by the outgoing president, in this case myself, and it's meant to represent a cause very close to their heart. In this speech, as my final act as your president, I'm given 10 minutes to convince you of something I care deeply about. So, I know what you're now all thinking with that context, and that's, what on earth is this girl doing? This is not a debate she can win. West intervention's been very resoundingly condemned in Cambridge. It comes up in this house every week as a counterpoint for a government we're arguing in favour of. I recall when our term card came out, there was a satirical review that asked us to look forward to Lara Brown trying to defend the Iraq War, a cause seemingly so impossible it rendered comedy, so thanks to the tit hauler for that. The difficulty is, the causes closest to my heart are things that I've wrestled with. They're issues that at some point I've been deeply torn on, and that's why I want us to debate Western intervention here tonight. I think it's in the deep spirit of the Cambridge Union. This is a society that has formed a crucial and integral part of my time at Cambridge. I've come to this chamber almost every Thursday for my entire degree, and I've wrestled here with very difficult concepts. I'm proud that this term we've run a series of debates that have tackled issues and changed minds. There's been a sizable swing against every motion or for every motion this week, and I have not left a single debate without having at least one of my prior views challenged. So I hope, for one last time in Michaelmas, we can grapple with a difficult concept and come to a difficult answer. And that's why I'm here before you tonight to argue that Western intervention has in fact been a force for good. I'm not here to defend every act of Western intervention, but I do sincerely believe that the defence of liberal democracy must be an integral part of Western foreign policy. And I do believe that when the West has intervened, it has, overwhelmingly, been a force for good. The motion at hand is a tricky one for me, which is entirely my fault because I set it. But it's asking us to consider things that are fundamentally unknowable. To say that Western intervention has been a force for good is to say the world in general is a better place for it. Now, it's impossible for me in these 10 minutes to set up a perfect counterfactual, to depict for you the parallel universe of what the world would look like had the West not intervened at pivotal moments in recent history. And I think that's the fact that's unfortunately biased so many of us against Western intervention. It's very easier for the media or politicians or even side opposition to get up and throw at me 10, 15 examples of the negative externalities of Western intervention. That's very simple, and I won't shy away from them. I'm going to engage with them. But I also want to talk about inaction tonight. Inaction is a positive choice, is a decision to do something, and a decision which has hurt people in the past. So, in the spirit of rising to the mantle of difficult questions, I'm going to engage in one of the most tenuous and difficult arguments about Western intervention, and that's dealing with Afghanistan. Afghanistan has come up almost every week in a floor speech. We debated New Labour last week, and I heard a lot of it there. So I want to give it some proper time tonight. On the 15th of August last year, after President Biden's administration resolved to withdraw American troops from Afghanistan, Kabul fell to the Taliban. Life for ordinary Afghans, and for women in particular, has become drastically worse since then. Just a few weeks ago, their Ministry for the Propagation of Virtue and the Prevention of Vice announced a ban on women entering parks, even when accompanied by a male chaperone. A further dehumanizing act, intentionally, deliberately intended to exclude them from public life. For as long as I can remember, Afghanistan, like Vietnam before it, has been deployed as a byword for the failure and hubris of Western foreign policy. In fact, a lot of people have stood up and given the exact case study I mentioned as an example of why Western intervention has failed. But I think that the fall of Kabul last year, far from vindicating isolationism, proves beyond all doubt the urgent need for Western intervention. However difficult it might have been to maintain British and American troops in Afghanistan, the country is tangibly worse off for their absence. We should, in other words, have intervened more and intervened harder. The West failed to assert itself significantly in Afghanistan, and that failure has resulted in the incalculable harm for millions of people.
On that point,
yes.
Was it the West's place to intervene in Afghanistan?
I'm not a moral relativist. I believe there's a correct way of life to live, and I believe that oppressing women, banning them from going outside, not educating them, is not the right way of living life, and it's not something I'm prepared to stand by and accept. I think this does come down to moral relativism versus some sort of belief in genuine ways of life that are correct. I struggle to stand by and watch women oppressed so brutally, watch men murdered in front of their children, etc., etc. We actually debated Afghanistan last year, and I was actually very surprised. The motion put before the House was this House would have remained in Afghanistan, and this chamber voted overwhelmingly in favour, in a recognition that intervention can do well when carefully managed, and intervention is necessary to protect the women and children in oppressive regimes. When we chose to leave Afghanistan, we forgot who we were fighting for. Before we left, Afghanistan was more prosperous and more stable than it had been 20 years ago. Withdrawal from Afghanistan was a mistake led by a harmful doctrine of isolationism, and a mistake we must never forget when setting future foreign policy. As I said earlier, this motion is difficult for me to prove. Said opposition need to find evidence of failed West intervention. I need to prove inaction has been harmful and show you how the West might look had the world not intervened. So, in an attempt to do that, I'll turn now to a position many in this room probably share, and that's the terrible failure of the West to intervene in Rwanda. I truly believe the West has a moral duty to prevent atrocities from occurring, a moral duty that flows directly from our disproportionate power and wealth. It is one of the greatest tragedies of the last century that this moral duty wasn't applied with respect to Rwanda. But after I get to something, I'll come back to you. Between the 7th of April and the 15th of July 1994, during the Rwandan Civil War, an estimated 500,000 members of the Tutsi minority ethnic group were killed. These deaths, due to our failure to intervene, must always rest on the shoulders of the West. So I hope now, taking this speech at its best, that I have demonstrated that inaction is a positive choice, it's a harmful choice, and a choice that has led to the deaths of millions of people over the course of history. I've dealt with archetypal bad intervention, and I'm sure you'll hear many more throughout the next hour. What I'm not sure you'll hear about are the countless, hundreds of examples of unambiguously good intervention that have taken place over the last century. This list could go on forever. I'm sure David wouldn't be thrilled if I spoke for a few hours on this, so I've got a list of 3 key ones I think are quite important. NATO intervention in Kosovo. By 1998, 300,000 Kosovars had fled their homes. Every attempt at a ceasefire agreement had been ignored. Every diplomatic routine had been tried. And yet, after a 78-day interventionist campaign by NATO, the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia accepted the principles for a political solution. They accepted an immediate end to violence and a rapid withdrawal of their military, police, and paramilitary forces. This crucial act of Western intervention helped relieve Kosovo Albanians from the ethnic cleansing that was carried out by the Serbs.
Point of information.
Yes.
So you claim that the American troops in Kosovo have been unambiguously good, but the intervention of Americans in Kosovo has not been ratified by the Security Council. Could you explain why that is, if it's unambiguously good?
Intervention in Kosovo has been very controversial because it wasn't ratified by the Security Council. I think waiting for the ratification would have been far too long. It allowed a number of deaths that weren't possible. And I think the fact that a genuine ethnic cleansing was paused justifies that action. I am aware of the controversy. Moving to a second example of intervention, Operation Palliser. In May 2000, the British intervened in the Sierra Leone Civil War, rescuing the capital Freetown from the Revolutionary United Front. This was an evil rebel group, and this is an example where I really believe moral relativism has no place on the world stage. They were a group that abducted thousands of boys and girls, forcing them to serve as child soldiers and sometimes prostitutes. Harrowing accounts of the war have reported that for entertainment, some soldiers would bet on the sex of an unborn baby and slice open a woman's womb to determine the winner. The leaders of this group were convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity in 2009. And yet, after just 18 months of intervention, the country was stabilised. A free and fair constitutional process was established, and the lives of 8 million people were improved. My final example, Operation Ocean Shield, a recent international response to a major hijacking for ransom industry developing in the chaos of the long civil war in Somalia. Piracy in the area had cost the global shipping industry around £7 billion a year. Many sailors lost their lives. Over 1,000 were held hostage for weeks, months, years, some never coming home to their families. In 2010, NATO recorded 45 actual hijackings, 132 attempted, and 147 harmful disruptions. By close of operations, this total had dropped to 0. When NATO closed the operation, we are now seeing it climb again. A need for sort of constant and careful Western intervention in these places surely is obvious at this point. I could fill hours with examples like this. I'm going to have to get through my speech, but thank you. I could fill hours of examples of successful Western interventions that have restored peace and democracy to countries in crisis, but I think David would get very angry with me. So I'll ask you instead to consider French intervention in the First and Second Ivorian civil wars, Australian intervention in the East Timor and the Solomon Islands, and American involvement in defeating brutal war criminals in Uganda. But I want to end my speech on the starkest example of the necessity of Western intervention in the modern day, and that is, of course, in Ukraine. Without Western intervention, Kiev would have undoubtedly been crushed, Zelensky likely deposed. Had our government and other NATO members not committed substantial equipment and military spending to their struggle against an unprovoked invasion, I dread to think what might have happened to Ukrainians. If you don't believe in an altruistic reason for intervention, if you genuinely don't believe that liberating the oppressed is important, let me try and convince you of pragmatic reasons for intervention. When we do what is necessary to preserve Ukraine's independence from Russia, we send a clear message to our enemies. We prove ourselves to be united and cohesive and strong, and by doing so, we make ourselves a good deal safer. Appeasement. And I'm afraid I really do think appeasement is the only meaningful alternative to Western intervention. Hasn't exactly worked well for us in the past. And a skepticism about intervention, when taken to its extreme, and you'll forgive me for low-hanging fruit, often has the paradoxical effect of making destructive wars, like the Second World War, far more likely. When we stand by, when we do nothing when women are killed in their homes, when children are forced into slavery, we embolden our enemies to the point at which they become existential threats. And so I urge you to accept that by pursuing our foreign policy objectives through different types of intervention, ranging from boots on the ground to international aid, we can secure our country's future and survival. And so, when you walk out of those doors tonight, please vote to grapple with a very difficult question. Vote for a country that stands up to its oppressors, which takes responsibility for its enormous privilege, and walk through the I door in recognition of the weight of that responsibility. Thank you.